The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints just made a monumental announcement where now women can serve missions starting at 18 years old, changing it from 19 years old. So men and women are going to be serving missions at the same age. This is a really exciting announcement. A lot of people are buzzed about it, but it has implications for what our missionary gender dynamics are going to be moving forward. And a lot of people are left wondering, why was it that way before? Why were women serving older? Why were they 21 or why were they 19? Why was there that disparity between the genders? And what a lot of people don't realize is that the earliest women serving in the mission field actually were younger than the elders serving missions at the time. And polygamy was a major factor in all of this. It helped to inspire women coming into the mission force in the first place. So I'm going to be breaking down and discussing the history of Latter-day Saint sister missionaries in the mission field, what catalyzed this change, especially with the introduction and then depreciation of plural marriage, and then, of course, how the age changes of Latter-day Saint sister missionaries have changed over time, how they integrated with a male missionary force, the challenges they faced, and then where are we today? How is this going to change moving forward? Because I don't think this is like a feminist agenda that is now catching up with the times, and this announcement is not a way to artificially pump up missionary numbers in order that, because it's an exciting announcement and people want to participate in the mission field now. Rather, this is the work of the Lord. And I think this is an exciting development that is a 150-year evolution in our negotiation and navigation of what missionary work and its connection to priesthood ordination is, because that is kind of the crux of all of this. So let's begin. The history of sister missionaries. So as we know, before the announcement that was made just a few days ago, elders or male missionaries would serve starting as young as 18 years old, and women would start serving as young as 19 years old. This was a change from 2012 when sister missionaries were often serving at 21 years old. And so they were a little bit older. Some of them had completed degrees, and a lot of Latter-day Saint women at that time had already gotten married before they reached 21. So it created different gender dynamics. But the announcement came that now allowed young women who choose to serve a full-time mission may begin their service at age 18 following graduation from high school. It also talks and emphasizes how missionary service is still a requirement for priesthood responsibilities, but it remains an optional opportunity for young women. We recognize that for young women who desire to serve a full mission, the choice of age to begin service will not be the same for everyone. So they also included in this article how the time for women to serve is going to stay 18 months. Male missionaries serve for a full 2 years, and women have traditionally served for around 18 months, and that is going to stay the same. They mentioned that they actually did some surveys and got feedback, and that many women actually wanted to stay the same age. And I'm a few days late to this because I've actually been out of the country. I went on a cruise with Go and Do Travel with some other Latter-day Saint podcasters you may or may not be familiar with, such as Ward Radio, Stick of Joseph, Jacob Hansen, Quick Media, David Boyce from 52 Churches of 52 Weeks, and Dave Butler, who's sometimes featured on some of these podcasts as well. But now that we're catching up with the times, most people don't realize that the earliest women in the mission field were actually younger than their male counterparts, and that's because the earliest missionaries didn't look like this. They often looked like this. They were often older men, sometimes in their middle age, with young families that had to sacrifice and leave their families for several years at a time, going without person script, sometimes going across the seas, going to the eastern states, going to Great Britain, sometimes going to the Middle East, going to the Pacific Islands. And so they often left families behind. And the reason that men were the ones called to serve has to do with pretty fundamental doctrine. So in the Articles of Faith, number 5 says, we believe that a man must be called of God by prophecy and by the laying on of hands by those who are in authority to preach the gospel and administer in the ordinances thereof. Now, I think a lot of us read this verse and we see it as a generic admonition that people who are called to do something in the church need to have the laying on of hands. But this is very specific about being called to preach the gospel. And it seems that that was how it was also interpreted in the earliest days of the church. Now, the Articles of Faith is not ancient scripture. It is based off the Wentworth letter, which is where Joseph Smith was writing to someone who was curious about our beliefs. So he was articulating our basic doctrines as best as he could. And so this talks about how in order to preach the gospel, you must be called of God by the laying on of hands in authority and administer ordinances. So this connects it to priesthood. Even more so in the Book of Mormon itself, the more even fundamental text building on the restoration. In Moroni chapter 3, it teaches that the manner which the disciples, who were called the elders of the church, ordained priests and teachers. After they had prayed unto the Father in the name of Christ, they laid their hands upon them and said. So these are the people who are elders. Today, missionaries are elders. That's like their priesthood office. And so if you're going to be an elder, you need to be ordained a priest. And it says, in the name of Jesus Christ, I ordain you to be a priest. Or if he be a teacher, I ordain you to be a teacher, to preach repentance and remission of sins through Jesus Christ by the endurance of faith on his name. Amen. And after this manner, they did ordain the priests according to the gifts and calling. So the idea here is that if you're going to preach the gospel, you need to be ordained a priest or a teacher. These are priesthood offices. And so it was very clear from the earliest days of the church that missionary work was priesthood work, was priesthood office work. You needed to be ordained a priest in order to be authorized to preach the gospel. And in fact, it was so much that sometimes they were even ordained to be 70s. This is Osmer Flake. He went on a mission in 1897, I believe. I don't remember where he served, but he records that as part of being sent off to serve a mission, he had to report to Salt Lake. He had already received his endowment, so he didn't need to go through the temple to receive that ordinance, but he did need to report to the Salt Lake Temple where he was ordained to be a missionary. And the specific office he was given was 70. He went to the Salt Lake Temple, the Salt Lake Temple Annex. This is what it looked like at the time. And he, along with other missionaries who were going off to serve, were ordained to be 70s to preach the gospel. That is like super different from how we're used to it being done today, where you're just set apart as a missionary. Back then you were ordained a 70 in order to preach the gospel. And this is really where the division kind of starts to, or this is how we have to navigate this issue, because if missionary work is connected with ordination to a priesthood office, then that is the role of men who hold priesthood office. Women are not to hold priesthood office. And so as women start to get integrated into missionary service, there starts to be a division between ordain and set apart. Today, we tend to use the word ordain in the church as a term to mean acquiring a priesthood office or receiving the Melchizedek priesthood, receiving the Aaronic priesthood, whereas set apart is something that we often use to designate receiving a temporary calling or assignment in the church. And so you're set apart to be a gospel doctrine teacher, but you're ordained to be a deacon in the church. However, it does appear that in the earliest days of the church, these terms were a little bit more interchangeable. And so missionary service was an ordination. Once missionary sisters started entering the field, it seems that that's where we start to differentiate a lot more between ordain and set apart. And we start using the word set apart in order to refer to sisters entering missionary work. And ordain is utilized for priesthood office. So the reason that women were often younger in the mission field is because, as I mentioned, the earliest missionaries were men who were like often in their middle age with young families going off to foreign lands. And it's one thing to be called to serve a 3-year mission in the eastern states, but when you're being called to serve in the Pacific Islands, like Joseph F. Smith was here, the church started to recognize that it was a huge burden, obviously, to ask these men to be away from their families. So some got permission to take their families with them. Now, Joseph F. Smith was not necessarily one of them. He was called to serve in Hawaii when he was 15 years old. So he was not married at the time. But many people started to serve these missions in the Pacific Islands, in Polynesia, and they were allowed to bring their wives and their children with them. And these wives assisted and supported in the missionary work. They were not called to be missionaries. They weren't like a senior service couple. They were not set apart to be missionaries at this time, but they were helping in the missionary work. An example of a couple who did this was Addison Pratt and Louisa Barnes Pratt. So they were called, or not they, Addison Pratt was called to serve a mission in the Society Islands, now French Polynesia, in 1848. And this one's a really fun story because Addison Pratt needed to receive the endowment before he served a mission. And the problem was there was no Salt Lake Temple built. There was no endowment house built yet. And this is really crucial because the endowment is so tied to missionary work. There's this sense that in the New Testament, that Christ told Christ told the disciples that they needed to they needed to preach the gospel to every kindred, tongue, people, nation, and they would have a sign that they would be endowed with power. And that sign ended up being the day of Pentecost. The Holy Ghost descends, they have tongues of fire, they speak with the gift of tongues, and that's like the sign that God is with them and he has endowed them with power to go forth and preach the gospel. And so the early restoration takes that same idea and says, okay, in order to preach the gospel to every nation, kindred, tongue, and people, we need to be endowed with power. How this was manifest in 1830s Kirtland was the school of the prophets. There was a kind of endowment. This included washing and anointing. Later on in 1840s, Joseph Smith instituted the full endowment ceremony that is more analogous to what we have today in the red brick store of Nauvoo, and where we have the washings and anointings and covenants and clothing, and it's a much more elaborate ceremony. But even still, in the earliest days in Kirtland, endowment of power was very closely tied with missionary work. So if you were going to serve a mission, you needed to be endowed. And that's kind of where that comes from. But because there was no Salt Lake Temple in 1848, there was no endowment house yet built. They brought Addison Pratt up to Ensign Peak. And on the mountaintop, a few elders came and they gave Addison Pratt his endowments there. It was a beautiful thing. And then he went off to the Society Islands to serve his mission. Another person who served a mission was Susa Young Gates. And what's important to know here is that at this time, the way that the women supported and assisted in the missionary work was largely domestic, was largely in keeping the house, cooking, cleaning, bathing, clothing, all of those things, being a support to the missionary who was called to preach the gospel according to that priesthood office. But they're also, it's I think, instructive to understand the dynamics of the Protestant model of missionary work and even the Catholic one. So, I mean, you think of like the earliest conquistadors, they're coming with their missionaries and they're converting a lot of indigenous people, but there's also an aspect of like civilizing the more barbarous aspects of these indigenous peoples. And that was considered part of missionary work. It's not just preaching the gospel, it's also introducing Western culture. And there seems to be some of that dynamic happening with Latter-day Saints too, not nearly to the same extent. There's no effort to just like blanket Western culturize all these peoples, but rather preaching the gospel is the primary function of a mission for Latter-day Saints. And that really has been from the beginning. But as these women are going out to the Polynesian islands, and they're looking for ways to support and to help and preach the gospel, there are some educational aspects happening. Susie Young Gates, what's her name? Louisa Barnes Pratt would hold a school in her home, just a few children, but teach them to like read and write in English and teach them about clothing norms in Western society. So Susie Young Gates also served, she went to Hawaii with her husband who was serving a mission in Hawaii. And she later on writes this fictional account. This is just like a fictional story to illustrate like how everyone can be a missionary, everyone can serve in their own ways. And there's a child that asks, "What can I do to be a missionary, mother?" And the mother responds, "Why, darling, every time you sweep the floor, if you do it well, you are performing missionary labor. The missionaries here must eat and drink and wear clothes. And when you make the house clean for Papa, it is just as credible so as the duty is concerned as to go out and preach like Papa does." So there's this sense that at least at this time, the women's role was to support, because missionary work couldn't happen unless these men were also being taken care of. And so their role was to support in that way and the more domestic side of things while the men were in charge of preaching. But that doesn't mean there wasn't proselyting happening in some respects with Latter-day Saint women. So go across the globe to Great Britain, there were Latter-day Saint Tract Societies where they would publish tracts or pamphlets that they would distribute. And a lot of women got involved in these tract societies where they would want to share their beliefs by passing out these pamphlets in their communities. That's where we get the word tracting. But yet, these women were not being set apart as missionaries. They were not being ordained as missionaries or assigned as a missionary. The women in the Polynesian Islands were largely a support role. And then these women in Great Britain were just doing it as part of a community function that they wanted to be a part of. Later on in the 1860s, they do start to set apart women, but it is not to proselyte, but rather to go on the mission with their husbands, and they still serve this supporting role. But in 1898 is when everything changes. This is the 1898 General Conference. Well, actually, this is a picture of the funeral of Wilford Woodruff that September, but this is a picture of the tabernacle. And in 1898, they made a momentous decision to allow women missionaries to allow women to serve missions. And this was a change made in March of 1898. And then in April of 1898, a general conference, they kind of rolled it out in a larger manner. George Buchanan gave the first address of conference and talked about how there will be an opportunity for women who are capable and who desire to go out under proper conditions. And this is where they announced that now women are going to be serving in the field. Yet he does say proper conditions, and at least in this discourse, he seems to imply that this means married women to not go unattended or alone, but where they have husbands who are going, they are suitable. In other respects, it would seem as though there would be no impropriety in going and bearing their testimony. So now women aren't just serving a supporting domestic role, but they're also sharing their testimony and preaching the gospel alongside their husbands. And according to George Buchanan, that seems to be the appropriate way in which women can assist in the missionary work. But they also are starting to call single sister missionaries to preach the gospel. Enter Inez Knight and Jenny Brimhall. These are some of the first two missionaries that are called as single sisters. They're not married, not attached, and they just wanted to go on a fun Europe trip. They Inez, I believe, was 22 years old. They were attending university, and they wanted to go visit Great Britain. I think it was Jenny who had her fiance serving a mission there, so they wanted to visit. And because this announcement had come out around the same time, their church leader said, well, what if this would be a great opportunity to also share the gospel? So they were called and set apart to be missionaries to serve in the conference, they would call it, not the mission, in Great Britain. But that leads us to the reason why. Why did these women serve a mission? Was it just because we wanted to be more egalitarian? There was a very specific reason why the church wanted missionaries, and that's because they were being highly requested. Mission presidents or conference presidents, stake presidents, they wanted and kept requesting and writing to church headquarters to send women. And the reason why is because this is what the world thought of Mormon women. Plural marriage was the manifesto came out in 1890, so the church had stopped practicing plural marriage in large part by that time, but yet the stigma of polygamy and bigamy was still very prevalent, where they thought that these poor, benighted Mormon women were enslaved, were in chains, were being held captive against their will. And so the whole world just thought these Mormon women were just completely victimized. And it didn't matter how often male missionaries would say otherwise, like it's just hard to believe. And so they kept requesting Mormon women to come out and share their testimony. Like, let's have them share their experience. This whole polygamy, anti-Mormon rhetoric was extremely intense in the 1880s, especially as they were persecuting, the U.S. government was persecuting the church to pressure them to stop the practice of polygamy. So while they were still practicing polygamy in the 1890s, the Edmunds-Tucker Act in large part disenfranchised the church, and there was heavy persecution on that front. You have a lot of these political cartoons talking about how awful like these Mormons are. And Mormon women were very passionate, so much so that they became suffragettes. They wanted to push for the right to vote so that they could vote, just live their religion. They wanted to have the right to vote to live plural marriage, which is wild. And so cool that these women wanted to share their voice and share their opinion and say, no, we are not benighted. We are not uneducated. We are not enslaved or brainwashed. We believe in the gospel of Jesus Christ, and we want to stand for what we believe. So they would, Utah was one of the first places to give women the right to vote. We were kind of one of the pioneers, if you will, in that respects. But this is where Elizabeth McCune comes into play, because she lived in Utah, and her husband and her were fairly affluent, were fairly well off, but her husband started to drift away from the church, yet she still had a strong testimony of the gospel. And she ended up going over to Great Britain to visit her son, who was serving a mission at the time in Great Britain. And because they were affluent and well off, while they were over there, they rented a pretty lavish home. And so much so that they housed all the missionaries there, or some of the local missionaries in the area. So they were kind of patrons of the missionaries. They provided for a lot of their needs. And yet at this time, there was a pretty intense and viral anti-Mormon book that came out in England that, again, was just lambasting the church and talking all about how poor and victimized these Mormon women are because of the practice of plural marriage. And so the church in response held a conference to just declare their beliefs, and they invited Elizabeth McCune to speak. She didn't want to necessarily do it. She felt unqualified. She's just this woman from Utah, but she was the only woman from Utah there. And so they're like, let's have a woman from Utah actually speak and say what she thinks about the church. And so she spoke. She said, our husbands are proud of their wives and daughters, and they do not consider that they were created solely to wash dishes and tend babies, but they give them every opportunity to attend meetings and lectures and to take up everything which will educate and develop them. Our religion teaches us that the wife stands shoulder to shoulder with the husband. And people were very impressed. They came away thinking, wow, she is very articulate. She's very eloquent. She clearly is educated. This is not at all what we were expecting of a Utah woman or a Mormon woman. And so George Buchanan, this is from that same conference talk in 1898 when they brought forth the new policy. He talks again about how effective the testimony of women are on this issue. He says there was one woman of some prominence that had not joined the church, though her husband had, but she had expressed herself several times in this manner, and Sister Piper visited there and became acquainted with this lady. And the lady was so pleased at meeting one of the sisters, an intelligent woman, a woman that did not look as though she was a poor, downtrodden slave, that she entered the church. No doubt it was due to the fact that she had found that the women were as intelligent, as presentable, and as ladylike in their sphere as gentlemen were in their sphere. And Joseph F. Smith likewise explains why we need women to serve. This is after the announcement was made. I think this is in the Juvenile Instructor. Maybe it's in the Young Women's Journal. I forget. But he talks about how important and what effect they have. And I love this quote. He says that we've become accustomed to saying only men can perform this labor, missionary work. But in later years, we've come to understand that the presence and testimony of an intelligent, faithful sister has, in many cases, more weight than the testimony of many elders. The testimony of women concerning their own condition accomplishes more good than that of 100 men. I mean, like, that's just awesome. Because the world has accepted and believed for years that our women are dominated and ruled over by men, that they are slaves, dupes, tools, and toys of the men. I mean, this could have been written in 2025. They think that they are vulgar, low, and ignorant. Now, I have advocated for years that we send out some of our sisters with their husbands as missionaries. Whenever our women have gone with the spirit of the gospel in their hearts, they have done a very great amount of good. Doors have opened to them, and they've gained a hearing in places where an elder would not have been permitted to step foot. And so the point is that a lot of these people just wanted to know, well, what we've been hearing a lot from Mormon men about how great the church is, but what about Mormon women? And so the church responded by sending out Latter-day Saint women to preach the gospel and share their own witness of what their experience has been, that of education, that of refinement, that of feeling like they are shoulder to shoulder with their husbands. Eliza Chipman is one such woman who served. She served in September of the year 1898, and so she was one of the earliest single missionaries as well. And she left very detailed journals, so we can get a sense for what she thought of this. And the reality is that integration with men and women in the mission field wasn't completely smooth, as one would expect. I mean, this is a picture of the Manchester Conference, or Mission as they would call it today, and you can see it's mostly men. There's like a couple women in there, and for a variety of reasons. On all sides, things can be challenging when you make a big shift like this. One of them was just the missionary culture was very male-centered and very male-geared. Like, the way you motivate your missionaries was a lot through, like, military rhetoric. And, you know, we're soldiers in God's army, and we've got to be strong. And in some cases, like, a lot of missions still, motivate their missionaries with that rhetoric. But it didn't necessarily resonate as well with some of the women. And some of the men underestimated the women. Some of the men dismissed the women for not being as valuable or not understanding what value they contribute, or maybe even relegating them to tasks that would have been more domestic instead of allowing them to preach. And the women likewise, some of them felt very valued and that they were really finding meaning in this mission and that they were preaching the gospel. And then sometimes they felt a little bit dismissed. And it's tale as old as time. Whenever we're going to be making shifts, sometimes there's a little bit of rockiness, but you also had mission presidents and leaders recognizing how important this was. Here's an image of Eliza Chipman with some missionaries she's working with as well. So in the improvement era, one of the mission leaders said that the idea of having lady missionaries is new in this mission, but it is no longer an experiment. The faithful labors of these sisters have gone far in making the mission what it is today. Neither their devotion can be questioned, nor their industry criticized. So clearly, Latter-day Saint women missionaries are making positive strides in getting in front of people, opening doors that the elders simply could not, because women have unique experiences and rhetoric and values that we can use to touch hearts in ways that men can't, and vice versa. So where does that leave us? Okay, so 1898, you have Latter-day Saint sister missionaries beginning to serve. At this point, men were still largely, so by 1898, the age had decreased dramatically. So you have, whereas in the 1830s, men were serving in their middle age with lots of families. As plural marriage starts to decline, you have this interesting phenomenon where you have an influx of single women. A lot of these single women were not being sealed into plural marriages, and so a lot of them were single. So all of a sudden you start to see this decline in age as well. And there actually was a period where a lot of younger couples would serve missions together. But there were challenges with wives going with their husbands to serve proselyting missions, because if they were, it was a lot of work to try to proselyte and to bear children, or some couples were delaying childbearing because they were on a mission, and the church doesn't necessarily advocate for that because family building is such a core tenet of our faith. Or they would have children, and then it would be really difficult to do the proselyting while you actually have children. And so the church started to move away from having young couples serve together and from having like older or middle-aged men serve away from their families. And instead there started to be this natural shift towards younger single members of the church. So polygamy and plural marriage created the occasion for women to enter the force because they were so needed. Plural marriage created this demand where we need women's voices, and it also created the supply, because as soon as plural marriage was done away with institutionally in the church as a practice, there were a lot more single women who wanted to contribute to the church in some way since they weren't married. And so the age starts to shift downward. By the time we hit the 20th century, I believe the average age had come down towards more like the mid-20s. 1951, the sister missionary changes to 23 years old as kind of the standard. And then in 1964, they changed women missionaries to serving at 21 years old. And that's the standard that we have for decades, whereas men serve at 18 years old, women serve at 21 years old, until we get to 2012, where President Monson announces that women can now serve at 19 years old, really disrupting and creating a new gender dynamic between the men and women on these missions who, I feel like, as someone who mostly was in the pre-mission age change time, there definitely was a little bit of a stigma sometimes of like, oh, if you serve a mission is because you didn't get married. And so there's a little bit of an old maid stigma. But this in 2012 like really changed the game. And then of course in 2025, just recently, we've now changed the age to 18 years old, which now we're going to be men and women serving at the same age. And I can only imagine that's going to change the dynamic dramatically. Now, this is a chart from scholar and friend Jonathan Stapley, where he put together just the percentages of women missionaries in the force over the years. So in 1900, not very many women are serving, obviously, and you can see two massive spikes, and I'll bet you could guess what those spikes are. So in the 19-teens, almost 40% of the missionary force were women, and then in the mid-1940s, much of the missionary force were women. And these are, of course, the two world wars. So this is less of a matter of a ton of women entering the mission field as much as a ton of men dropping out of the missionary field. I mean, many men were called to enlist in the military, and so there were fewer men serving missions, so the percentage of women were higher. But from what I can tell, the amount of women serving in the field has pretty much just steadily increased, except for those two spikes. From 1898 until today. So today we have about 25,000 women serving and 60,000 men serving. So that's about 29% of the force from what I understand. Please correct me in the comments if I get any of these stats wrong. But this is a pretty big shift from 2012 when the mission age change from 19 was made, or from 21 to 19 was made, because at that point, women were only 12% of the missionary force. So clearly we are seeing a rise in women wanting to share their testimony. And where does this leave us? Is this the church finally catching up with the times or like capitulating to feminist agendas? Is this like the church trying to artificially pump up missionary numbers by making an announcement that allows more people to serve? I don't think so. This is the work of the Lord. I do believe that this is a great opportunity for women to now participate in the missionary work and to share their unique voice, their unique talents. But I don't think that it's too simplistic to say that this was like oh, we were benighted back then, we didn't know any better, and we were more sexist back then, and now we're, we're making more egalitarian strides. And certainly culture plays a role in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And certainly we have not been perfect when it comes to the relationships between men and women. But when you see how tightly tied missionary work was to priesthood and to endowment, you can see how this was a complicated process of trying to figure out and learn line upon line, precept upon precept, using revelation from the Lord and through his prophets and apostles. What role do women have in missionary work? We began the Restoration believing that this was very strictly a priesthood responsibility, and the church still holds today that missionary work is primarily a responsibility that priesthood holders have, but it is now an opportunity for women to participate as well, and they've been answering the call. So I hope we can have grace for the history of our church as we navigate this complicated way of trying to figure out what is God's will and how do we understand the relationship between priesthood and missionary work and ordination and endowment. Now, women and men are receiving their endowment as soon as they graduate high school in many cases and are seeking the blessings of the fathers as Abraham sought his. And I think it's a beautiful, exciting thing. Now, was this President Oaks trying to push forward a new decision that now that he's the prophet, he can just make changes? Was this in the works for a long time? Ultimately, I don't know. But the reality is, like, our church is a fairly traditional, slow-moving church because there's a bureaucracy, and I do believe that's a feature, not a bug. We like to make changes methodically and prayerfully, so I'm pretty sure if I had to make a bet that this was in the works for a long time, and it's just finally rolling out now. So this isn't necessarily a prophet pitting against each other, but this is a really exciting opportunity. I'm so eager to see how this develops and changes our gender dynamics in the mission field. Does this create, like, I don't know, more of a dating atmosphere? Most missionaries are supposed to not date, or all missionaries are supposed to not date when they're on their mission. They're supposed to like lock their heart and focus on the missionary work. But when you put a bunch of like men and women together of the same age when they're young single adults, stuff's going to happen. So I am interested to see how this changes the gender dynamics, how this changes the roles and the leadership opportunities women might have. And I drew heavily from this history from Matthew McBride's article, Female Brethren, Gender Dynamics in a Newly Integrated Missionary Force. And I also drew a lot from Jonathan Stapley's work. He has a new book called Holiness to the Lord and also The Power of Godliness. And I am eager to know in the comments what you think. How is this new mission age change going to alter the dynamics between men and women serving to preach the gospel together? Thank you guys, and we will see you next time.